Dear colleagues and friends of the Norwegian Institute in Rome, the first part of this is in Italian, but I see that there's not a lot of Italians here, so I'm translating it back to English. It's a great pleasure to see you all here this evening, to welcome you to the annual Lorang lecture at the Norwegian Institute, which is a celebration of our history and the establishment of the Institute. And I am particularly happy to welcome among us this evening's speaker, Professor Rubina Raja from Århus University. We will primarily be speaking in English. If anyone feels the need for posing questions in Italian, they may do so. Rubina understands Italian afterwards. After the lecture, there'll be a round of comments and discussion, but then I would like to invite everyone for a refreshment on our terrace. Unfortunately, it's 5 floors up, but the view, as I usually say, is worth it. The founder of the Norwegian Institute, Hans Petter Lorang, was awarded his doctoral degree 85 years ago with the thesis Studien zur Geschichte des spätantiken Porträts. It's not a programmatic endeavor of the Institute here to mirror Lorang's scholarship, but I wouldn't say by coincidence, but it wasn't very, very planned. Rubina Raja and the theme that she will be speaking about, the Palmerin portraiture, do create links through time, from Lorang to the present. Rubina is a professor of classical archaeology and art at Århus University. She's also director of the Danish National Research Foundation Center of Excellence, Center for Urban Network Evolutions. This center studies and compares the archaeology of urbanism from medieval Northern Europe via the ancient Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. And it explores how and if urban networks sparked or encouraged, but were encouraged by societal expansions and environmental crises in the past. She is also involved in the excavations that will hopefully soon start on Caesar's Forum here in Rome, which is co-funded with a generous grant from the Carlsberg Foundation. She's co-PI with the main PI, Dr. Jan Kindberg, who spends a lot of time here in Rome, but is based at the New Carlsberg Glyptotek in Copenhagen. The project will engage some of Rubina Raja's methodological interests, high-resolution archaeology and archaeological fieldwork, and I would assume also archaeology and the intersection towards natural sciences. Our Rubina and my paths have crossed on certain occasions, partly because we share a common concern for the stewardship of source materials for studying the past, and particularly concerned with the trafficking out of the Middle East, as well as a shared involvement in the very successful Northern Europe collaboration, the Nordic Graduate School in Archaeology, Dialogues with the Past. Rubina's research is built on a robust empirical, methodological, and theoretical foundation, and otherwise, apart from the themes I've mentioned so far, includes the Eastern Roman provinces in the Levant, Hellenistic to early medieval periods, religious identities, and Hellenistic and Roman iconography and portrait studies. She and Andreas Kropp have recently published a collection of articles in 2016 that were published by the Royal Academy of Sciences and Letters in Copenhagen. And so the theme of portraiture and Palmyra, perhaps made more urgent by the more recent political events in the Middle East, has led to the theme of this evening's lecture, From Palmyra to Rome and Back Again, Palmyran portraiture and their narratives. I don't have to introduce the city of Palmyra or Tadmor, but Rubina has led a project, the Palmyra Portrait Project, since 2012, which is funded by the Carlsberg Foundation, where Rubina is PI. So this lecture is going to explore the Palmerin funerary portraiture and its development with reference to the city's wider global settings in the first 3 centuries of our common era. The lecture will explain itself, of course, but the importance of work like that done with the Palmyra Portrait Project has only grown in light of contemporary events in Syria and the Middle East. And the Norwegian Institute has registered this interest through the traffic on our digital channels, where the advertisement and the material that we've posted for this evening's event has been extensively, I think without precedence, the most shared material that we've had through our digital networks, particularly among communities of Syrians and in Syria. And we are therefore, we will also be recording this evening's proceedings. So if anybody doesn't want to be in the same room as the camera, they'll just have to leave. But so we'll be posting this in a week or two, so you can revisit it or share it among your friends, and I'm sure it will be downloaded extensively in Syria. And we're very pleased to welcome Rubina Raja to the Norwegian Institute and look forward to a lecture.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today. I've been looking very much forward to that, and thank you for the very nice introduction as well, Christopher. Yes, so I'm going to talk about the Palmyra Portrait Project, about Palmyra in Syria, and about the corpus that I've been compiling with a wonderful research group which I head and who always get to stay behind at home. But a lot of thanks go to them, and I'll of course mention that at the end also, because they are the ones also doing the work on a daily basis. And I think that's important to remember in a time where humanities also are moving towards greater and larger collaborative initiatives, but it's always the head who gets to do the fun stuff. But there's a lot of hard work done by a lot of other people as well. So my lecture is very much about the portrait habit as an urban phenomenon in the Roman period. It's about Palmyra in the Syrian desert, and it's about Rome in the East, and it's also about collection histories and about how we disseminate knowledge through collections in a variety of museums around the world. And that'll get to involve Rome as well, as you'll see. The Palmerin funerary portraits are the largest group of Roman period portraits stemming from one place in the ancient world and outside of Rome. But they have never been collected as a corpus. And it cannot be underlined enough what a big lacuna that is in research, because in classical archaeology, we have since the time of Winkelmann, who died almost 301 years ago, been studying portraiture and the meaning of portraiture and self-representation in the ancient world. But we have done it very much from a Eurocentric perspective. We've done it on the basis of Greek portraiture, Hellenistic portraiture, and of Roman portraiture. So if we want to sort of pass beyond just this way of viewing the development of self-representation in what we may dare to mention, say, a global world in the first 3 centuries CE, we need to look beyond the borders of Rome itself. And we can only do that if we have material that is tight and large enough, can be dated, and can be studied in detail. And that is the reason that I, in 2012, initiated the Palmyra Portrait Project. It should be said that the idea for the project came a bit before, but you know how it is with funding. You need to write an application, you need to have a dialogue with the funders about how you're going to spend the money, and before you know it, 1.5 years has passed and the civil war in Syria had begun. But it's also important for me to say that this is not a project that sprang out of the civil war situation in Syria. It is in many ways a very boring humanities corpus project, but what I want to show with this lecture also is why it is so important to do these sorts of projects and the relevance that they actually can have in a very developing world. Palmerines made it quite a bit around the world. We know about their extensive trade relations in the Gulf area. We know about connections to India. We know caravans that they were head of and that they financed and protected through their military power. But we do not know very much about the connections to the West, but we know that they were there. I will soon have a book coming out, a collection of articles called Palmyra and the Mediterranean, which will be published with Cambridge University Press, where we in detail have looked at the sources that actually testify to the Western connections of the Palmyrines. And they were, of course, also even in Rome. They were banned to this side of the Tiber. So Trastevere was the area where we know of a Syrian sanctuary and potentially a Palmyrene sanctuary as well. We have altars dedicated to Palmyrene gods, Malakbel and Aglibol, to the deity Alat as well. But all this material has been found out of context, and the few archaeological in situ remains, architectural remains that are there, can be said to have belonged to Syrian cults, but we don't know exactly where these, or whether these sanctuaries were Palmyrene or not. But here you get a map from Religions of Rome by Beard, North and Price from 1998, which is actually the best sort of summary of the architectural material left. And as you see, number 14 down here in Trastevere is the supposedly Palmyrene sanctuary. And it seems that the Syrian cults were situated in this part of the ancient city, and therefore I also thought that it was very fitting that that's the topic that I speak about today, because we are actually almost in Palmyra on this side of the Tiber. So as said, it began in January 2012. It's financed by the Carlsberg Foundation generously and hosted also generously by Århus University in Denmark. The Palmerin funerary limestone portraits constitute, as said, the largest corpus of portraits from the ancient world. I estimated first that there were around 1,500 of these around in museums, collections, and in situ in Palmyra as well. I was wrong, because we have now collected more than 3,700, which makes this an even more significant material of group. And I also think it's important to say once in a while, as an academic, I was wrong. I mean, this is an estimation of the big publications. I did that estimation on the basis of the big publications, of course, when you begin to look at much smaller collections, a lot of small collections make a big difference. This also means that this is an extremely good corpus of material upon which you can actually do very good statistical research. And that's also something that brings us further in our studies of self-representation in the ancient world. These portraits also have a very tight chronological framework. They were produced between the very late 1st century BCE, and we don't have a single one which is dated to after the sack of Palmyra by the Emperor Aurelian in 272 CE. So 300 years of portraits and this amount, and that is pretty spectacular for an ancient context. 2% of these are dated through inscription, so we have the date of the deceased's burial, and the largest collection outside of Syria is at the New Carlsberg Glyptotek in Copenhagen, and that was the point of departure for my studies, for beginning the studies. So here you get the freshest numbers from the database, and here you see the number of portraits as of last night, and you see how they're divided on groups. Single portraits were by far the most used sort of monument. These were used to close off burial niches in massive family tombs that could hold up to 400 family members. Also with multiple portraits, or even the earlier full figure stele, banqueting scenes with husbands and wives and other family members. In the later 2nd century, the sarcophagus monument is introduced as the family monuments into the graves, showing more than 12, 15 family individuals in one scene. So it was really the rise in wealth and also military power that gave way to innovation and expansion of the urban site of Palmyra, or Tadmor as it was called in antiquity, in the late 1st century BCE. And that's also when these portraits were introduced and served as commemoration plaques closing off these burial niches. So there was a coinciding of a monumentalization of a cityscape together with a larger wish for showing the representation of the individual within the family group. Palmyra was a tribal society, and what does that mean? Well, that means that we know that it was based on 12 large families, extended families, who had a variety of branches and founded all these in the first period, all these massive tower tombs, which are also really unique to the landscape of Palmyra, and later massive underground tombs where they buried their dead. So these loculus reliefs, as we call them, were high limestone reliefs showing the deceased very, very often together with an inscription giving us the name and the family fathers up to 5 generations back in time. So there was a lot of focus on what the individual meant, but what the individual meant within the group. They were then set up in front of these burial niches in up to 6 or even 8 rows, closed off, and the tomb could be extensively decorated, as you see here also. Here you see a profile of one of the famous grave towers from Palmyra. So on each story you would have burial portraits, and in the hypogea as well, which could expand over generations and get new corridors, you would find the same sort of commemoration. And what you would end up with were family galleries showing generations and generations of Palmerin families next to each other. In fact, the same thing was going on in the public sphere. Palmyra has extensive colonnaded streets. You here see a view towards the temple of Baal, or the sanctuary of Baal, the main sanctuary of the city. And you see here the colonnaded main street and the side streets. As with so many other classical cities, only a very small part of Palmyra has been excavated, and all focus has almost exclusively been on the monumental city center, and domestic housing has not been what has been the interest of archaeologists to any great degree. But actually an Italian mission has excavated one late antique private house. But what happened in the public sphere was that on the consoles, on the columns, on the main street and side streets, as well as on statue bases down here, extensive amounts of portraits were also set up of Palmyrene citizens. We of course know this tradition from the Greek and the Roman world, with honorific statues put up of living and dead people in order to honor them for all the good that they did for the public. And there we have the funerary sphere in Palmyra as a pendant, where the family would do something in private, and in public you would have your honorific statue set up instead. And these statues, there are not very many left of them from the public sphere, because they were made mostly of limestone, some of bronze, some of marble, imported marble. There was no marble in the Middle East, so all marble found in Palmyra would have been imported. And marble and bronze were the two materials which were also remelted or reused in late antiquity. So we most often find the limestone sculptures, but they can also be weathered. So the material from the funerary sphere is really what was handed down to us in the best way, because it was set up inside closed tombs. What one also, of course, tends to forget is that these portraits were not, as they are today, completely stark and white to look at, but they were polychrome. They were at least partly polychrome, because when you imagine that you come into a dark tomb where you only have oil lamps or a little bit of light, even a partial polychromy would have made a big difference. So in the middle here you see the so-called Beauty of Palmyra, the main piece in the New Carlsberg Glyptothek's collection, and you see that all her necklaces are actually painted with leaf gold and different red colors to show the different qualities of the gold. And you see another example here also where the jewels are highlighted, but here you actually also even notice that some of her makeup is left on the portrait as well. So with very very sealed and very directed partial polychromy, a lot of effect could be achieved. Some of these portraits have been found in situ, not very many. We've collected them all, so a total of 50 graves, and there are more than 600 graves in Palmyra, but only in a total of 50 we've found some in situ portraits. And you can see one example of a reconstruction that we've done where we know where the portraits actually came from and were sitting until recently. But no undisturbed grave has ever been excavated in Palmyra. And therefore it is actually difficult, if not impossible, to reconstruct complete family genealogies. And I say that because I'm often asked the question of, well, why don't you do more family genealogy research? So that is one side to it. The other side to it is that Palmerines were often called the same. And in the funerary sphere, family names were of course not used because you knew which branch of the family you belonged to. So you would have, for example, as this is the case, Matana, son of Bona, son of Jaibol, son of Salamoy, son of Bona. So you can see that grandfathers or great-grandfathers or the great-grandsons were sometimes called the same as their grandfathers and so on and so forth, which of course makes the situation a little bit complex. Nonetheless, what is important about these inscriptions were that they identified for the present then the exact person who the deceased was, and people would have known which family they belonged to. As said, although we for quite a while have known that this group of material must have been the largest group of material from the Roman period stemming from outside of Rome, they have never been studied as a collective phenomenon. So focus has been on collections or on groups of material, but no study focusing on situating these within their time and within the global world of the Roman period has been attempted. The way that they came into European and later American and later other collections in the world is also an interesting story. So Palmyra is said to have been rediscovered by Dawkins and Wood in 1751. They set out on a trip, for an educational trip for young men. They were upper class British elite, and they did a lot of work in Palmyra of drawing and stitches, and became very famous for what they did. So James Dawkins died not long after returning from this longer trip to the Middle East, and his brother had this painting made showing Dawkins and Wood in the moment when they actually rediscover Palmyra. And for its time, it's of course a wonderful example of Orientalism, of the West rediscovering the East. I mean, Dawkins and Wood are even wearing Roman period togas together with their multicolored riding boots. Can't imagine that they really showed up in togas. But Gavin Hamilton, or probably the brother of Dawkins, decided that that was the pose that these two young men had to be shown in. So the West rediscovering the East, pointing towards the now not more existing triumphal arch in Palmyra. And it was about 50, 70 years, as far as we can tell, after that, that Europeans began to travel extensively in the region and also take home with them these portraits. So we've done, I've been involved in an online exhibition with the Getty, who for the first time actually exhibits these portraits together with their originals of Dawkins' drawings. And right now, the exhibition Loss and Remembrances on at the Getty Villa with 21 pieces from the New Carlsberg Glyptothek, among those the Beauty of Palmyra, who is out traveling for the first time in 90 years since she came to Copenhagen and into the Glyptothek's collection. These are slides from the exhibition. Here you have the original manuscript of Dawkins, and you see some reproductions of the very detailed drawings. Here the Temple of Baal, the Triumphal Arch, monuments that unfortunately now, because of the Civil War, do not exist anymore. But Danes were really front runners then, as they are now, we like to say, and were part of the first researchers who actually mapped parts of this region. Johannes Elliot Østrup traveled on horseback from Egypt to Copenhagen, funded by the Carlsberg Foundation in 1891 to 1893. I can say they don't fund horses anymore, but a lot of other important infrastructural research means. And he came to Damascus and heard about Palmyra, decided to spend some time in the Syrian desert. He spent then more than 3 months mapping, as one of the first Europeans, big parts of the central Syrian desert, including Palmyra down here. He didn't spend a lot of time in Palmyra, but he did some important observations that he published in 1899 in the Royal Academy of Sciences and Letters collection of articles. He writes about the extensive vandalism that already is taking place at this point in time, and about how people simply smash up statues, take heads, and sell them on for a couple of francs to a traveling Brit. I guess this sort of goes for a lot of nationalities, because in later descriptions he also tells that it's the greedy European collectors in general who actually initiate this sort of first looting of Palmyra. It's an interesting observation, I mean, in the time of day that we are living in, where we always seem to have the right take on what goes on with the cultural objects. Carl Jacobsen, who was the founder of New Carlsberg Glyptothek, gave his collection to the Danish public in 1888. Before then, he had extensively bought Greek and Roman period portraits and other ancient objects for his private collection in the old Glyptothek. He had also in the 1880s bought a very extensive collection of Palmerin portraits, among other things through the Danish consul Leutwed, who was based in Beirut at that point in time. He bought them because he already saw that they would be the most important comparative material, as he writes, to Greek and Roman period portraits. So it's interesting that he saw that, but it took so long time for people actually to do something about it. But it's in principle thanks to him that we could initiate this project. He then brought the collection into this is a slide of the old Glyptothek before the new one was built, but he already, right after he gave the collection to the Danish people, had Rabbi David Simonsen do a catalogue of these busts in the old Glyptothek, and then had them moved to the new Glyptothek afterwards. He even was so visionary that he bought a Palmerin mummy. Not many exist, but mummification was the burial form in Palmyra, so you would put them, as you saw, in on a burial niche and close them with the funerary slab. We have been looking for this for a while, but we also found the New Carlsberg Glyptothek publication, where it is described that in the moment that it arrives from Beirut and shipped to Copenhagen and they open the box, it dissolves because of the trip. So it doesn't exist anymore. But the reason he bought it was actually very interesting, because he said he was sure that in the future researchers would find a way to compare the actual portraits with the mummy through new techniques to see whether Palmerines in fact looked as their burial portraits. I mean, today we know that this is not the case, that portraits are idealized, that they are made in a style, that it doesn't matter whether they one-to-one look as the deceased, but still there's some sort of interesting thought going on at already this point in time. So it's too bad that we don't have it anymore, because as I said, these are very rare. There's another Dane who played a big role for Palmerin studies, and that's Hal Inghalt, who had a very interesting career. Among other things, I mean, he had several degrees from Copenhagen. He taught at Århus University. He fled to United States with the last boat out through Finland. His family was already there. He was married to an American woman. And I recently met his 90-year-old daughter at a retirement home outside of Yale, where she still lives, who told me that he actually met his wife on a world trip on a ship between Japan and China. And his wife's mother fell so much in love with Inghalt that she invited him to come home to Princeton with them. So that was his way into American academia. But enough about that. He also conducted important field work in Palmyra in the 20s and the 30s. And this was really a time where a lot was happening in archaeology in the Near East. That was actually where things were happening. It was where urban archaeology was being reinvented, and it was where an international society of people really met every spring and every summer. We published a little book about him some years ago, and also soon have a larger book in Danish coming out about what he did. He was extremely active, and I just love this letter that I got from Yale University Archives, because they offered me the archives that were still left there, where the librarian writes him that the librarians are in two minds. On the one hand, we thought we might be able to reduce our staff at the circulation desk when he retired. On the other, we worried for fear that you might step up your activities in the library now that you're relieved of your teaching responsibilities. We also worried about a possible shelving crisis if you returned all of your books at one time. So he obviously went over time with some of his books. But we wished you taper off very gradually. I think this is a wonderful testimony to the fact that librarians are people with great humor. And I think we should all remember that. But you see, even at old age, he was quite potent, and he did a lot of important research, not only on Palmyra, but the Near East in general. He also collected a paper database that he upkept until the 80s. So he collected an archive which is now at the New Carlsberg Glyptotek, which comprised about 800 of these portraits. And they were the first basis for our corpus. So we concorded all collections in the world that we know of with his paper archive, and could therethrough tell very interesting stories about how objects have moved from collection to collections, or from the private collections into museums, and so on and so forth. This is just to give you one little insight into what's going on and why there are so many people busy at home working on this. This is only screenshots of parts of a front page, so we describe extensively these portraits and their collection histories and their measures and their color traits and so on and so forth, so that we can do extensive statistical research on these. But Inghalt, as so many other archaeologists, unfortunately excavated a bit more than he could publish. He excavated more than 40 graves in Palmyra, and he published about 6 of these. Luckily, he also left us his Excavation Diaries, which I'm in the process of publishing, and they should come out next year, which really give new insight into what went on in the graves that he excavated. Among other things, he has color sketches of objects that he found and the colors that they actually had at that point in time. And on the other, we can also, through his archive and his excavation descriptions, now concord objects that he took to Beirut and had, among other things, taken to the New Carlsberg Glyptotek, or where other collectors actually came and bought pieces. And that's very important information now, because we can recontextualize these things into their original grave context. One example is the so-called Beauty of Palmyra, where Inghalt writes in his diary that it's the most beautiful female bust he's ever seen, with colors still on it. And then he describes the wonderful afternoon that he came out there and saw that it had been found in Qasr Abyad. And when we got that information, we could recontextualize this piece that until then had been said to be bought from a French Jew in Damascus. And now we know that it was Inghalt who excavated it himself, and it comes from an elite tomb in Palmyra. So one example of what this archival research can do, archive archaeology. He gave back this archive to the Ny Carlsberg Glyptotek in the 1980s, and since then it's been there. But he already in 1928 had published his habilitation about Palmerin sculpture in Danish. There was 529 portraits published in this book that until now has remained in Danish. I had it translated, and we are commenting on it now to update the object biographies, and it'll come out in the first time in 90 years in English next year. So that's actually 91 years. We had hoped to have it out this year, but we're not going to make that. So that still remains a standard work on Palmerin sculpture, because what Inghalt did was to do a strict typology, stylistic development of these portraits, which we can now refine on the basis of the much more material we have, but he did a very good job. So that's sort of the history of how portraits began after the rediscovery of Palmyra to get into collections around the world. And Italy is no exception, but as you can see, it's actually also surprisingly few portraits that are in Italy. So there are 3 collections further up north, and then we have Rome as another center for Palmyrene portraits, where there are 4 collections who own Palmyrene portraits. The Vatican holds the largest collection, and in the Bullettino we are bringing out a special volume in a couple of weeks' time on this collection, which we've restudied and republished. These are the portraits from the Vatican Museum, and as you see, they are very diverse, but also distinctively Palmyrene. They have an interesting collection history, because 3 of them, we know that one of them comes from Jerusalem, 2 of them we don't have a collection history from, but 10 of them came to the Vatican by way of Federico Seri, who I'm sure that other people than me know more about, but who was a famous art historian, collector, benefactor, and very much more, and had a big influence on art history and collections in Italy. He originally came from Homs in Syria, or not he, but his family, and that is why he began to collect Palmyrene portraits, because he wanted a family gallery of his own. So Homs, or Emesa, the ancient Emesa, is not very far from Palmyra. He couldn't get portraits from Emesa because not very many exist, but he could get 10 from Palmyra that he spent ages on buying up from different auction houses and other private collections, donated them to the Vatican, and that's where they are. But really, through this collection that we've done, we can now begin to examine a string of cultural phenomena over a period of 300 years and say completely new things about family constellations, fashions, representational values, so on and so forth. And that is why this material is important to me. But Palmyra is, of course, so much more than just that, because it's also trade relations on a global scale. It's a complex family-related society, and it's a society that was very dependent on the Efka spring for the oasis that it was actually situated in. And my research and the research we are undertaking within the project is, of course, not situated in a vacuum out of nothing. People have written books for a long time on Palmyra, on the religious life, on the social structure, and so on and so forth, dominated by 2 big strings in research, namely the French-based tradition of the longue durée, advocated by Maurice Sartre, and on the other hand by Sir Fergus Miller on the Roman Near East, who advocates that the Near East was a blank slate after the Hellenistic period, that it suffered from a cultural amnesia, and that is why it was so thoroughly Hellenized by the Greeks. Most likely, reality lies somewhere in between, but it all comes back to the fact that we are missing a lot of archaeological evidence from the Hellenistic period in the Middle East, which we simply have a hard time with grasping in the archaeological record. But that's important to keep in the back of one's mind when dealing with a society like Palmyra that also seems to rise out of nothing in the late 1st century BCE, but which we know from sources that go back to the 2nd millennium BCE, because there Tadmor is actually already mentioned in the Mari archives. We of course also know about Palmyra because of Zenobia. Because of Zenobia, Palmyra had actually been known long before its rediscovery by European travelers. The Historia Augusta tells us about her, and she became the downfall to Palmyra because of her provocation towards the Romans, when she wanted to actually make Palmyra its own empire, not paying taxes to Rome anymore and not being under military domination anymore. And for a very short period of time, for the 5 years she reigned, that was what Palmyra aspired to do. We have no portraits of Zenobia, apart from the ones that we find on the coins that are not struck in Palmyra. So from Antioch and from Alexandria, we have coins that she struck during her reign, which shows her as a Hellenistic ruler, much in the image of Cleopatra the Great, for example. And then, of course, we have the later fascination with her in painting, where she is usually shown as a true Roman in the 18th, 19th century art. Portrait habit, an urban phenomenon. It was extremely important to be described in antiquity. Description made an important part of how people understood each other, and of course the history writers were no exception to sort of underline that people's physical appearance had a lot to say about their inner spirits. So this is the description, one of the descriptions of her from the Historia Augusta, where it said that she had a brownish complexion, a dark color with black eyes that were unusually lively. She had a godlike spirit and an exceptional charm, and so white were her teeth that many thought they were pearls, not teeth. And her voice was imposing and manly. So these very few lines say a lot about how women were perceived at that point in time, and should be perceived something between godlike and exceptional, beautiful, and on the other hand, extremely masculine. The one with the teeth almost can't be true, because we know that the spring water in Palmyra is full of fluoride and chloride, so most Palmerines must have had very brown teeth. So you have to wonder how it was being Zenobia in a very male-dominated society. She took the power from her not-of-age son, or she ruled on his behalf, but of course only for a very short time. We know that statues were put up of her in the public sphere, but none of them have been handed down. We also know that women in Palmyra were usually veiled when in public or in religious procession, as here shown, completely veiled, where you cannot even see their faces. This is a little bit also handed down to us in the funerary sphere, where most women wear a veil over their head that they could draw in front of their faces if they needed to. Luckily, Nathaniel Andrade, a good colleague of the project, has just published a monograph on Zenobia, which for the first time pulls together everything we know about her. And a former doctoral student of mine, just a month ago, published a monograph, which is her PhD thesis, turned into a book on the funerary representations of Palmyrene women. So now we know so much more about those. But Zenobia fascinated not only people in ancient literature, but also Italian opera writers. So Rossini in 1813 premiered on La Scala with Aureliano in Palmyra. Usually these operas were about how the emperors would fall in love with Zenobia or the other way around, and then it would all end in a big mess, and Palmyra would be sacked and she would be killed or dragged off to Rome and so on and so forth. So it was a classical, wonderful love story that went wrong and that probably set emotions high in the opera house. And here you see, again, an extremely classicizing scene set from Rossini's 1813 opera. So we all know now where Palmyra was situated, not least due to the newest development of the Civil War, where things really took off in a detrimental direction late 2011. It should be noted that the first monuments that were bombed in Palmyra were early Islamic monuments. So they were saints' graves from a different string of Islam than the one that's advocated by so-called ISIS. It was not the Greco-Roman monuments that were the first focus of the destruction in Palmyra. But that followed, and as we all know, many of the big monuments have been damaged, and here you see a slide from the museum also, which is completely smashed as well. Here, busts, Palmerin grave bust, taken to Raqqa in northern Syria and smashed there on the border, and so on and so forth. We know of grave towers that have been bombed, and these things will not be able to be reconstructed in any foreseeable future, although there has been a Russian delegation who have said that by next summer Palmyra will be open for tourists again, because they will be sending a delegation of archaeologists there to rebuild things. I mean, I doubt that it can be done that quickly, but let's see how that works. So we are confronted with images like this, the Temple of Baal, which after the bombing looked like that. What we must not forget is, and that is not to say that there's any justification in what has been done, but let's not forget that European archaeologists deconstructed all medieval, all Islamic, all heritage that was post-Roman period when they dug in Palmyra. Here you see a drawing by the Danish architect Charles Christensen in 1928 of the Temple of Baal, but in its medieval fortress state. And when archaeology was organized in Palmyra, it was decided to dismantle all medieval architecture within the sanctuary and only leave the Roman period monuments. The interest in Palmyra from the side of the rebels, of course, also didn't come out of anything. The Assad regime had its most important political prison underground in Palmyra. As a Syrian, that was not the place you wanted to go. So about 4,000 political prisoners were sitting in an underground prison very close to the ancient site. So infrastructurally, Palmyra was and is still located extremely centrally in the Syrian desert on the big routes from east to west. And that, of course, on top of that, for ISIS also makes Palmyra a place of interest. But to return to Zenobia and what she did for the Palmyrines, she expanded Palmyra to its largest extent ever. She took Egypt, that was what one did when you wanted power in the East in antiquity, but she also took large parts of what is today modern Turkey, Anatolia, and completely cut off the Romans from the Eastern trade routes. That is not something that they took lightly, and Aurelian, he went there twice with his legions to keep Palmyra and the Palmyrines under control, and succeeded. But she was only an intermezzo. Many centuries before, I mean, Palmyra had had a long time to flourish. It was massively built out of the local limestones. We know of more than 15 quarries around the city. Massive architecture with more than 200 by 200 meters sanctuaries, a main street about 1 kilometer long, and extensive amounts still hopefully underground. But also the art and architecture was extremely fascinating. I don't like to say that it was a melting pot, because I think that doesn't leave much to the local society. I much more advocate that it was center of a knowledge culture of what was going on in the world, and there you could pick and choose from different styles and different artistic styles, and also use your own local way of expressing yourself. This is, for example, one of the important marble statues. It's an Athena Parthenis copy made in Greece, imported to Palmyra, but set up in the sanctuary of Alat, so identifying or personifying the Palmyrene female deity Alat. Here you see a relief now at the Louvre, much more in a Palmyrene style with a strict frontality of the three main gods of Palmyra, Yaribol, Aglibol, and Malakbel. On the other hand, in the wall paintings, you see scenes from Greek and Roman mythology, here from the Odyssey, and you see a level of craftsmanship where you know that these craftsmen must have seen what went on in the central parts of Rome, because the quality of the wall paintings that are preserved are really, really high. So that, of course, ties in together with the level of mobility that Palmyrenes had. We know that Palmyra was, so to say, the last stop on the Silk Route. So that was where camel caravans were reloaded to donkey caravans. And we know that from the tax tariff that was set up in Palmyra. But we, of course, also know that these caravans had to come to Palmyra by different routes. And actually, a big research project at the University of Bergen in Norway was recently completed. And this is a map by Eivind Seeland, who's an associate professor in global history there, and he has mapped all the water resources around Palmyra and shown that caravans could have taken quite different routes than the ones we've known until now. He's done that on the basis of Cold War Russian maps, which had surveyed wells, springs, and cisterns, and made extremely detailed maps of the whole region. And when one interprets these maps, what we see is really that if you wanted to know how to move in the desert, the steppe desert, you probably had to be a Palmyrene, because you had to know your region. So foreigners or people who didn't know the desert could not move around that fast. But if you knew where the water resources were located, you could move much faster than other people. And that is an important key to Palmyra's success in also keeping military domination over this whole desert region. And of course, the involvement in trade is also reflected in the art of Palmyra. So on sarcophagi, for example, we see loaded camels ready to go. And here we even see a Palmyrene caravan leader or ship owner standing with, on the one hand, his camel on a line, and on the other hand, with his hand around the prow of a ship. So these were people who got along, who got out in the world, and we also know that the Roman governor of Bahrain for a while was a Palmyrene. We also know that they served in the Roman army. They were really wonderful archers, and there's even a relief on the column of Trajan, which might show a unit of Palmyrene archers in one of the Dacian campaigns. We also know that they served even as far away as Britain and married local women. So this is a grave monument for Rubina, who was a freed woman who had married her former master, who was Barates, a Palmyrene soldier or trader. So Palmyrenes, apart from being strongly locally rooted, also had envoys and embassies that they sent around in the world that they traded with. So trade was the first and foremost way that they made their connections. And I've written a small article which recently came out about the rise in monumentalization of the cityscape, the self-representation, and the trade relations in Palmyra. Palmyra is also what can be said to be the only bilingual city in the Near East. We have several hundred bilingual inscriptions from the public sphere, in the one hand in Greek and on the other hand in Palmyrene Aramaic. These have all been done or all been studied by Jean-Baptiste Dion, who's really the front runner epigrapher on that front. And they tell us about the fact that Palmyrines really knew how to situate themselves in a global world, and there you would speak Greek. Latin, unfortunately, didn't matter very much in the East. So even the big tax tariff, which was set up to only regulate quarreling in Palmyra among the Palmyrines about their trade, was set up in Greek and in Palmyrene Aramaic, and tells us a lot about how trade locally was regulated. But in the funerary sphere, the Palmyrines couldn't care less about the outside world. So almost exclusively Palmyrene Aramaic is used, in a few cases 32 Greek, and in 5 Latin. But they really knew how to bring in, again these are watercolors done by Charles Christensen, bring in the public sphere even to the funerary sphere. So here we see actually watercolors of wall paintings stemming from graves in Palmyra, where Hairan, whose grave this is the foundation inscription, had images done, or his children had images done of him, we don't know, of his honorific statue that was standing on the main street in Palmyra, and of that of his wife. And that's interesting because, as said, we don't have many of the female honorific statues handed down to us, but showing that you could basically bring your honorific statue with you into death, and then you would have your portrait set up in front of your burial niche. Again, interesting because we see the polychrome clothes that they are wearing, which also tells us something about the richness of Palmyra and what you could afford to wear. The diaries are a good example of how we can now recontextualize small bits and pieces that have been published into much larger unpublished grave contexts. Palmyrines knew how to set up their hair. There are around 27 Palmyrene women who chose not to wear veils, so that's not very many out of almost 900. But they also knew how to do it in their own style. They seldomly really just imitate empresses' hairdos, and their clothes is also varying very much from Greek and Roman dresses to more Parthian-inspired banqueting clothes, and the Palmyrene priests are a complete story for themselves. What we can tell through the corpus also is that there are many more women than we would have expected, almost half, 40%, that's not bad. And they are not only shown together with their husbands, but also in single depictions in their own rights. Children, more than 350 representations of children, either together with siblings, but also on their own, also shows that the family connections and relations in Palmyrene families extended beyond the people who lived beyond childhood. Sometimes they do resemble the Roman Empire that they served beyond under, but often it's because they are non-Palmyrines. This is a squadron member who moved to Palmyra, probably married a Palmyrene woman, and died there, but not an indigenous Palmyrene. Palmyrene portraits are not like the Fayum portraits that really closely follow Roman fashion trends through the period that they were produced, but they have a much more firmly, locally rooted way of showing the identity which was expressed in the grave, because this was exclusively meant for the grave. In the public sphere, they would adhere much more to Greek and Roman traditions. The 10 that I showed you here all come from the history of, or the Museum for Cultural History in Oslo, because there are 10 in the collection there. So what we can do now through the corpus is to group these in various constellations, single portraits, individuals by far the most, but also multiple constellations in other localist reliefs, and big elaborate banqueting scenes on reliefs and on sarcophagi. But there is always and exclusively an emphasis on family and family relation. The tribal structure really comes through in the funerary sphere, maybe also not surprisingly, of course, but there was also no emphasis on civic offices whatsoever, no public offices, nothing is mentioned in the funerary sphere. That's exclusively kept to the public sphere. Of course, it was for us a new challenge with the situation in Syria, because we began to monitor the art market, both the so-called white auction houses, but also what we could of the black market. And just in the first couple of years after the Civil War, big auction houses sold a lot of these portraits, until it became very clear to them that there was not one clean one on the market anymore. And we actually had some of these auction houses retract the sales and have them repatriated, even though that's also a very complicated situation with the present state in Syria. We have been part of monitoring projects, monitoring the looting of artifacts from the museum and from graves. Recently, for the first time, we have seen in private collection objects that come directly from the walls of the museum in Palmyra. One thing is, when it's illicit new excavations, we can't say anything about where they directly come from, but when artifacts from the museum begin to peek up in private collections, that's a different story. You can buy these pieces on eBay once in a while, and they have, of course, gone up through the roof in price also. But what we cannot monitor is, of course, the black market. So Gaziantep, for example, close to the Syrian border, is a place where a lot of pieces pop up, and I, of course, don't have an overview of how many that is. I only see what journalists or what colleagues sent me or what other relations sent me. Here you see one wonderful example, again, of a freshly excavated priest portrait, where you see the color traces still on the clothing, and that's, again, to come back to the part polychromy of these portraits. But the falsifications is another area which is really booming. Big collections are sold. This is a collection of 25 that was recently sold to a collector in Russia. I mean, to many of us, clearly fakes, but also clearly made in Palmyra, because they are done in the local limestone. They are definitely done by people who know Palmerin portraiture, but they are also done by people who have an artistic streak and just can't help putting a Palmerin child with the feet on the shoulder of the mother. It would be so easy to copy these one-to-one, but even in the sad situation of the Civil War of Palmyra, there is some artistic strands in the people who actually do these pieces. So we can say that the production takes place there, because we can in some cases say that it's the local limestone. And there really is a whole own trajectory of this local production of these portraits. And it's really spurred by the power vacuum. So what we see is that sometimes originals are sold together with falsifications to sort of push more out of the region and, of course, earn more on them. What we can also say is that dealer routes, in fact, seem to stay the same, but expand their business. But I think that despite all these dilemmas, which really also arise from the conflict of Syria, I mean, I have material here that I couldn't show you tonight. For example, the maps of where exactly all Inghalt's graves are located in Palmyra. All these sorts of things that morally and ethically would put me in a difficult position, because we don't want people to use this material to actually find the places and so on and so forth. Still, this corpus has managed, I think, to put emphasis on the fact that big portrait corpus stemming from outside of Rome are really also important to study in order to push classical archaeology and the study of self-representation and identities in the Roman Empire on. And we are planning for publication in 2020. We have 2 publishers who are interested. The corpus is more than 18,000 pages, so it does take quite a bit of a publisher to take that on. And in a couple of weeks, the collection of the Vatican Museum is coming out in a co-publication, which I did together with a former postdoc in the project and Jean-Baptiste Dion, who does our epigraphy. Again, just to sum up, if you want to read more about the project and all our publications, you can visit our webpage. But I would like to thank, as the last thing, all the people in the project for their hard work and for staying at home and being available all the time for all my queries into the database. And of course also to Alessia Amenta at the Musei Vaticani for letting me publish their portraits. Thank you very much.